How could you make wild magic more meaningful than just rolling on a random table? This might be the coolest take on wild magic sorcery that I've ever seen in my time in D&D. What's up, I'm Josh, and this is Copper Dragon Games. My favorite characters in role-playing games are those that subvert expectations without being the anti-stereotype. Because let's be honest, the anti-stereotype is pretty much a stereotype in and of itself. This video kicks off a series in which I take a look at some characters who don't really fit the familiar archetypes that we are used to seeing. Each of these character concepts will take something somewhat familiar and turn it on its head a bit, or at least look at it from a different angle to make it something significantly more interesting than what you're used to seeing. And in this installment, we're going to be taking a look at the Wild Magic Sorcerer. In a nutshell, the Wild Magic Sorcerer is just a sorcerer whose magic goes off the rails sometimes and does some things that we would call, well, unpredictable. When a Wild Magic Sorcerer casts a spell, all kinds of things can happen. From the really good stuff, like gaining all your sorcery points back, all the way to really bad stuff, like fireballing yourself, and then everything in between, including some stuff that's just plain weird, like turning your skin blue. Now, wild magic sorcerers have been causing all kinds of unpredictable shenanigans since the beginning of 5th edition, and their roots go all the way back to 2nd edition. And the turns of events that can be introduced to a story due to the roles that a wild magic sorcerer can take on the wild magic table, they can be pretty wild and interesting on their own. But let's add another twist to make it even more interesting and meaningful than the standard default wild magic sorcerer straight out of the book. What if your wild magic sorcerer was connected to a divine or other planar being of some sort, a god of prophecy perhaps, who was using those wild magic surges to communicate with the player character? Imagine a sorcerer who sees every wild magic surge as an omen or a prophecy. So whenever a surge triggers, they spend some time trying to figure out the meaning, what they were supposed to interpret from whatever being is trying to communicate with them from the results of that surge. What did I do so wrong that I deserve to be polymorphed into a succulent? A beard of feathers? Really? What is this supposed to mean? You get the point. It's a small tweak that affects the meaning of a game mechanic without actually changing the mechanics themselves, and has the potential to add a lot of depth to the roleplay that happens at your table. Because there isn't anything mechanically special about this, you could just leave it as is and just play a wild magic sorcerer and build the character however you want. But if you want to take it a step further and represent this mechanically somehow, there are a lot of ways to do that too. The easiest is probably just to take the acolyte background so that you've got an element on your character sheet that lends itself to you having this connection to a divine power of some sort. You could also take it a step further than that and multi-class as a cleric or a paladin. If you're going cleric for this, the prophecy domain from Kobold Press's Deep Magic is a wildly appropriate subclass for this. But if your DM doesn't allow you to take third-party resources, then the good old knowledge domain from the player's handbook works perfectly good as well. You might also consider taking the Ritual Caster feat at some point in the future so that you can work toward getting the Augury and Divination spells, which you can use to take a step further in trying to interpret all of those wild magic surges and what they actually mean. And speaking of what those wild surges actually mean, there is so much that a DM can capitalize on here. Maybe those wild surges don't mean anything at all, and the DM will determine that it's just the player's own internal conspiracy theory of sorts. But personally, as a DM, I find that approach kind of lame. I would definitely lean into this and figure out what in the story could be connected to this. What if those wild magic surges really are communications from on high? What if there's something truly wrong in the divine realms and the PCs have to go and solve whatever that problem is that's making communication so haphazard and weird compared to what it's been in the past? Maybe it's another entity altogether communicating with the player in this way, and the player discovers over the course of the campaign that those messages were not who they thought they were from. There are so many clever ways that this could be woven into a story. DMs, I'd love to hear, if a player brought this to your table, what would you do with it? And players, does this sound interesting to you? Is this a concept that you would be interested in trying? And while it might be technically sidestepping the content of this video, if you have a character concept that doesn't fit the mold, that subverts expectations without being the anti-stereotype, I'd love to hear what you'd come up with. See you in the next video.